As intellectuals.
You know, you see these bums, blowing up the campuses.
An effete core of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals.
You know, you see these bums, blowing up the campuses.
An effete core of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals.
If the French withdraw, Indochina would become communist-dominated within a month. The U.S., as leader of the free world, cannot afford further retreat in Asia. It is hoped that the U.S. will not have to send troops there, but if this government cannot avoid it, the administration must face up to the situation and dispatch forces. If to avoid communist expansion in Asia and Indochina, we must take the risk now by putting our boys in, I think the executive has to take the politically unpopular decision to do it. Vice President Nixon, April 16th, 1954. The country might indeed be gone. There are 4 dead Americans on the campus of Kent State University, gunned down by other Americans. Tear gas seeps through the air of a half-dozen campuses. Mass rallies are building. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee wants to go right after the executive branch and take back its constitutional power. The fear among my friends is general about a possible military coup. From Indochina, we hear news, as we have for so long, from Peter Arnett of the Associated Press. The forces of what is laughingly referred to as the free world are moving into Cambodia, burning and shooting and destroying. Kids from Iowa are asked to distinguish between Cambodians and Vietnamese. Artillery is fired at moving human beings. The B-52s fly from our privileged sanctuaries in Thailand to churn up the earth. Here we come, Cambodia. Stick with us and let us give you freedom at 17 rounds a second. And in Washington, Richard Nixon stands on the same corrupt language that he gave us 16 years ago. The president, we are cautioned, has facts that we don't have. One wonders, what are the facts? Have the Viet Cong finally built an airplane? Has Vincent Price built them a laser beam that will drill through the earth and destroy Palo Alto? Or did we discover that those gooks, dinks, and slopes were determined to fight on, and that they did not need Marx and Engels to provide them with reasons? It is typical of a man whose closest friend is a bonds lawyer that he has no real care for language. If you can get young Americans to think of people as dinks and slopes, you can persuade them to kill those dinks and slopes. When you call campus dissenters bums, as Nixon did the other day, you should not be surprised when they are shot through the head by National Guardsmen. Nixon is as responsible for the Kent State slaughter as he and the rest of his bloodless gang of corporation men were for the anti-integration violence in Lamar, and for the pillage and murder that is taking place in the name of democracy in Cambodia. There was always this doubt about Nixon. He seemed a neuter, a man of no strong ideas or feelings, who had tried to fill his emptiness with glib anti-communist rhetoric. His crusade against Alger Hiss always seemed to be not so much based on deep convictions as on the visibility it would give Nixon himself. He had come from obscurity, and Alger Hiss was a way to prove his own existence. Nixon lusted after power, and when he got it, there were still men who refused to give him proper respect. Some of them were Asian peasants. Others were students. Others were newspapermen, elected officials, and even members of his own party. Now he is striking out at all of them in the largest and grandest last press conference of them all. Long hairs, Senator Aiken, Senator Fulbright, editorial writers. You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore, gentlemen, after he's through with this country. If those bums get out of hand on the campuses, then go along with Ronald Reagan. Only a couple of weeks ago, Reagan called for a bloodbath to solve campus disorder. Well, now he has it. Committed at the hands of the draft dodgers and the Guard. Nixon and Reagan. A fine pair. A fine madness. Perhaps it is now time to really find out why Nixon visited a doctor, a shrink, during the years he spent in New York recovering from the 1962 humiliation in California. Was it his manhood, as the rumors had it? His actions since the defeat of Harold Coswell make one wonder. Is he proving his masculinity at the expense of Asian peasants? Is he showing what a macho he can be by unleashing the ugliest barroom instincts in Agnew, Mitchell, National Guardsmen, and the American populace? We should know, because we simply can't afford 2.5 years of a president who might have those problems. We don't need therapeutic foreign policies. Not with our sons he can't. Not with our brothers. There are several conventional political courses which can still be followed before we end up in a state of domestic barbarism. The Senate can take the money away from the executive branch by repealing the Tonkin Gulf Resolution and by demolishing the defense budget. That won't do it all. But it might bring Nixon his senses. If it does not, then there is one further course. Nixon can be impeached. I realize that this might leave us with Agnew. Well, then do it again to Agnew. The Congress kept Coswell out of the Supreme Court after first keeping out Clement Haynesworth. Why not make the same kind of parlay out of Nixon and Agnew? There is no way this country can live when it has two neuters commanding power, devoid of true compassion or true ideas, dedicated to the eradication of opposition, domestic and foreign. This country was the creation of brave men. In the past few years, we have seen our soldiers machine gun girls and babies and old women. Some of us were insulated from that by distance, or because the dead were Asians. Now the dead are Americans. At Kent State, 2 boys and 2 girls were shot to death by men unleashed by a president's slovenly rhetoric. If that's the brave new America, to hell with it. The downtown streets were drowning in police. On Exchange Place, 6 helmeted police sat poised on horses. At the corner of Wall and Broadway, there were 5 sawhorse barricades back to back, with a line of police in front of them, another line of police behind them, a space of about 25 feet cleared down the street, and still another set of barricades holding back the crowds who were assembling for the businessmen's peace rally on Broad Street. I was looking down Wall Street when I heard the troops of the new bullyism marching up from the Battery. They were singing "God Bless America," one of our less elegant national jingles, and waving flags and showing off signs about supporting America. There were hard hats among them, the plastic yellow visors gleaming in the sun, with rum-hurt faces underneath the visors and muscles clenching in the jaws. But it was more than construction workers yesterday at noon. They had been joined now by all those white-collar workers one always sees lounging at street corners on Broad Street at lunchtime, making sucking sounds with their mouths as girls go by. They were there in the Robert Hall suits and the dandruff on the shoulders, the army of the $125 a week clerks, inflamed now by the excitement of doing something that seemed to them important, something that would give them an opportunity to strike out at all the privileged, at all the pampered, at all those children whose fathers had given them books instead of the strap, at the mayor who had gone to Yale and was forever taller than they would ever be. "Impeach the red mayor," said one sign. "Support hard hats," said another. They chanted "USA all the way," and as they marched, from the buildings came ticker tape and IBM cards in a celebration of the new bullyism that seemed more ominous than anything I had seen in the past 2 terrible weeks. On the sidewalks, otherwise decent-looking men and women were applauding as the hard hats and their supporters went by, giving their imprimatur to stomping, kicking, the throwing of bottles from high windows, the art of the double bank, and vicious cowardice. "Don't worry, they don't draft faggots," read one sign carried by a particularly gross-looking young woman. She was definitely not the sort of woman that your ordinary card-carrying hetero would pull into an alley. But then all of these hard hat actions have carried with them a peculiar kind of distorted sexuality. There is something drastically wrong with grown men, 1,000 strong, whose ultimate political statement is to stand in City Hall Park chanting, "Lindsay is a faggot." What we saw yesterday, even more than last Friday when the majority of them were construction workers, are the sour children of right-wing frustration. They had voted for Goldwater and Buckley and Procaccino, and the goddamn Pinkies kept winning. There were enemies everywhere: Lindsay, Goodell, Fulbright, Douglas, reporters, Jews, long hairs, students, Black Panthers, demonstrators, girls who didn't wear bras, people who sold pornography, everybody who, in their view, had turned America from the earthly paradise into a seething cauldron. It had never been an earthly paradise, of course. America is still a possibility as a country, rather than an accomplishment. The tragedy is that so many of those who were on the street yesterday refuse to accept anything other than the myth. And they didn't want to hear or even tolerate the suggestion of some other way of thinking. After the businessmen's peace rally was over, the peace people started to leave Broad Street, while the hard hats and their supporters waited on the other side of the barriers. A 30-ish man in a hard hat stood up after talking to the police and said to the crowd, "The lieutenant wants us to wait 10 minutes. He's gonna clear the pinkies out of the area and we can have it. There was a huge cheer. You know, the cops are on our side, so let's sing God Bless America. What do you say? There was another loud cheer, and they all started singing. After a while, they marched up to the stand used for the peace rally and sang God Bless America again and the Star-Spangled Banner. Over on the side, 3 young Vietnam veterans I know gave the V sign, and the enraged started screaming. Son of a bitch, commie bastard, screamed one red-faced fat guy in a wrinkled suit. Better dead than red, he shouted, and those around him took up the chant. The cops made the Vietnam veterans leave, and a few blocks away, a woman in her 40s had told some of the hard hats to grow up and act like men. They covered her with spit. God bless America. The leaden Brooklyn sky was heavy with the threat of rain. Police lolled against the walls of Prospect Park, while young people drifted in and out of the middle-aged crowd. A rock group called Power was setting up instruments, and 3 men worked on a hastily assembled public address system. They were familiar with it all now. They had done this before, in 100 different places. The wonder was that they could still go through the motions when so many of them must have felt that it no longer really mattered. Killing had brought them together there, as it had before. The young people had been in Bryant Park last October and in Washington in November. They had marched in peace parades and worked for Gene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, and a lot of them there yesterday had served in the armed forces in Vietnam. They wanted the killing in Indochina to stop, or at least that part of the killing which Americans were responsible for. Nobody, of course, was listening. Suddenly, it was 1967 again. The generals whose Boy Scout rigidity had spawned the Vietnam disaster were now talking about victory. The South Vietnamese army, which could not beat anyone in its own country, was now marching grandly into another, stealing chickens along the way to show its prowess. We had a new and glorious theory now. The way to end a war is to widen it. In other words, if you are losing a fight in a bar room, the way to win it is to hit 5 or 6 other people in the place. And out on that cold street corner yesterday afternoon, you found that there was nothing more to say. We were bombing the North again. Bella Abzug and Adam Walensky and Howard Samuels came and talked. Aled Lowenstein arrived at the end of the rally, as did Paul O'Dwyer. Robert Morgenthau spoke. Sam Myers of the UAW spoke. And so did a number of other good and generous human beings. But we had heard most of it before. I thought, I've been writing against the war for 5 years, and these people have been marching and speaking, getting beaten, arrested, and tear-gassed for longer. And what really happened? Nothing. The people who rule us go on and on, bombing peasants, sending our children and brothers out to be slaughtered or mutilated. Almost 50,000 have been killed, 235,000 wounded, and billions of dollars have vanished down the Asian rat hole. Meanwhile, we have the dread Agnew on TV yesterday explaining that one of the major missions of the Americans in Cambodia was to destroy hospitals. Right in the great tradition of Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and Abraham Lincoln. America über alles. In the Pentagon, some crew-cut child tries to take the smell of the charnel house out of our actions by saying that the bombing of the North the other day was a preventive reaction strike. That's beautiful. As we all know, Albert Anastasia was the victim of a preventive reaction strike when the mob blew his head off in that barber shop. And Pearl Harbor was a Japanese preventive reaction strike. It is probably no accident that all of this has happened since Harold Carswell was rejected by the U.S. Senate. Anyone who watched Nixon on TV that night had to worry about the man's control over his emotions. Those emotions have always been either mediocre, all that vile tapioca about his poor childhood, his football coach, his wife, and this great nation, or bullying. In the weeks since his defeat over Carswell, Nixon has invaded Cambodia, bombed the North, and called student dissenters bums. There is something ominous in his constant shift of tone and emotion, playing the God Bless America bit over the astronauts, posing before the front door of the Joint Chiefs, and coming on TV to explain a naked invasion as if he were making a great personal sacrifice for his country. He invoked the 1954 Geneva Accords without ever once mentioning that the Second Indochina War started in 1956 when the Eisenhower-Nixon regime broke these accords by canceling the elections in South Vietnam because Ho Chi Minh would have won fairly. He never mentioned that the presence of our army in South Vietnam is as clear a violation of the Geneva Accords as is the presence of North Vietnamese troops. He never mentioned that we have our own sanctuaries in the Far East, in Thailand, in the Philippines, in Formosa, in Guam, in South Korea, in Japan, or that we have our own mercenaries breaking the Geneva Accords every day in Laos. But perhaps the most terrible thing about the speech was that Nixon didn't feel the need to even lie about a legal justification for the invasion. At least good old Lyndon Johnson used to talk about the Cito Treaty, the Tonkin Bay Resolution, or some other piece of bogus paper. Nixon didn't even feel he had to do that. We must start with one basic proposition. There is nothing very brave or very marvelous or very exhilarating about 5 grown men punching, kicking, and stomping a 127-pound high school student. This is the work of cowards, of men who have so forgotten what they once were or where they came from that they can act like animals and call it patriotism. But the assaults of the construction workers on young demonstrators last Friday, the wild tone of the demonstrators at City Hall yesterday, the beatings of people with peace buttons on the outskirts of the crowd are not as simple as they look. The construction workers, after all, have been breaking the federal laws against discrimination for years. But there are several other factors involved. One is Vice President Agnew, who has spent the last 7 or 8 months going up and down the land, feeding hatred instead of trying to assuage it, creating paranoia about the media, and inflaming passions that did not need much to ignite them. Nobody seems to have explained to the construction workers that the war in Vietnam is the basic reason for the fact that unemployment in construction is now up to 7.9%, the highest of any industry in the country. Agnew and Nixon won't tell them that, and neither will George Meany. It's not black carpenters they should be worried about, but the possibility that another year of this endless war will put them all on the street together, that the jackhammers will fall silent and the steel remain at the plant. At that point, it won't matter how long you've held an ironworker's book. There just won't be a job to go to. But the spookier aspect of it was the behavior of the police. The construction workers first opened fire on a line of demonstrators last Wednesday as they went up Broadway past a building on the corner of Cedar Street. Bottles, beer cans, and clumps of asphalt came raining down. There were no arrests that day, and none the next. When the construction workers opened fire with an even heavier barrage and a rerun of Wednesday's action, that set the stage for Friday. On Friday, the construction workers beat people, bloodied strangers who tried to interfere, grabbed long hairs, smashed windows at Pace College, and ran inside, overturning tables and punching faculty members and students. And still, there were no arrests. Now the police department is investigating the charges of police inadequacy, asking people to call in with information about the beatings. This is ludicrous. On Friday, the police collaborated with the construction workers in the same way that Southern sheriffs used to collaborate with the rednecks when the rednecks were beating up freedom riders. The technique is simple. The police simply stand aside and let the rednecks do what the cops are unwilling to do themselves. In this case, cops can't investigate the cops. If the police were serious about enforcing the law, they would have made arrests on Wednesday and Thursday when the construction workers first started making their assaults. In a case like this, we have larger issues working than simple assault. Many of those students who marched up Broadway were not radicals. Some were marching just to protest tuition hikes. Many of them still had some residual respect for the law. But when I asked Inspector Harold Schreiner how he expected them to care about law and order when the construction workers were getting away with felonious assault, he told me that these bums, the protesters, had no respect for the law. If there are indictments coming down after this, Schreiner should be indicted for dereliction of duty, for not making the original arrests, which might have headed off the later violence, and for inciting to riot. It isn't very hard to sympathize with police officers who are called pigs by numbers of demonstrators. They aren't pigs, of course. And when it comes to handling demonstrations, our police are usually a hell of a lot better than the police in other cities. But many of them still have a sense of the demonstrators as the enemy. They don't like people with long hair or disorderly clothing, or those, especially girls, who use obscenity as casually as construction workers use it. And one of the reasons why the police do not wade into the construction workers and make massive arrests, imagine what they would have done if 200 Black Panthers had charged a group of Vito Batista's legions, is that the construction workers are people they know. They drink with construction workers. They are related to them. They went to school with them. You don't make arrests within the family, especially if you share a common enemy. And yet, the beatings did take place, viciously, in a cowardly fashion, wrapped in the flag, encouraged by the president, the vice president, the Daily News, and the cops. The iron workers I knew when I was growing up were largely tough, brave guys. They wouldn't double bank a man or hit him with a wrench or stand around kicking him. They did it with their hands. This was another breed, I hope, or else those others have changed completely. I can't imagine that they went back to Brooklyn to brag about how they saved the Republic by beating up children. But perhaps they did. After all, their government is telling them that violence is the solution to arguments, domestic or foreign. If the president feels that he must prove his manhood or power by committing violence, we should not be surprised when construction workers agree with him. It is Sunday now, and the army of the young is gone. A bright sun is playing on the monuments and the parks. The walls of buses have been removed from the White House. No jeeps rumble through the streets in convoys as they did through the night. There is still a taste of tear gas in the air, but the weekend is now over. The army of the young has gone home, taking with it its style, energy, sweetness, outrage, and courage. It might never come back, except in triumph. They came streaming into town early on Friday, and by Saturday, there were thousands of them. Legions from Kent State, students with T-shirts from Cornell and UCLA and Princeton, tough street kids from Brooklyn, girls with gleaming faces, boys with blonde mustaches and cowboy clothes, short-haired boys from the University of Virginia wearing white medical smocks. They were the army of the young, invading the privileged sanctuaries of the country of the old. How could Ellsworth Bunker, 76 years old, telling his antique lies on Meet the Press as I write, ever understand those 200 people dancing naked in the reflecting pool? There it was, Fellini calling for a dance of the young, those young, lithe bodies glistening in water that was designed to be still and uncommitted, splashing it high and wild until finally at some point in the afternoon, they created a rainbow. In all those dry years of his life, I would bet that Ellsworth Bunker never created a rainbow. Could Nixon, in his hunched, tight style, wearing a dull banker's suit through all his waking hours, ever understand what it must be like to be 18 years old and make love in the grass at the foot of the Washington Monument at midnight? Could Nixon, who seems to have never been young, really know what those boys and girls must have felt walking hand in hand? Washington has always seemed a dull and bloodless town, filled with gray bureaucrats and their servants. But on this weekend, it seemed something far worse. Now it feels like a town whose confidence has been forever cracked. The capital of a nation that should command the young everywhere through its idealism and spirit, but which has sold itself to the lies and crimes of old men. When I was 10 years old, I used to choke up at ball games when I saw the flag going up the flagpole, one 19-year-old from Brooklyn said to me. And now I look at the flag and I want to throw up. It stands for everything that is rotten to me. Nixon's agents went scurrying around all day Saturday, trying to communicate with the young. And Nixon himself has made a bizarre early morning visit to students at the Lincoln Memorial. But all of them seem to miss the point. Nixon, the country's #1 fan, thought he could assuage the legionnaires of the young by talking about football and surfing. The others thought that all they had to do was talk. But the young have been lied to far too long to be conned anymore. They know that when the Young Republican Alumni Association is through talking to them, Americans will still be bombing and shooting Asians. Our allies will still include dictators and perfumed brigands, and the rats will still rule Hunts Point and Brownsville. The rally itself had little focus. There were songs by Phil Oakes and Judy Collins, and a lot of speeches. There were congressmen on the speaker's stand. Representatives Ryan, Schauer, Ottinger, Lowenstein, Koch, Burton, and others. Howard Samuels was there, Shirley MacLaine and Bella Abzug, and Dr. Spark and Allen Ginsberg. The Jerry and Abby show stood in the wings, laughing and kidding around. Jane Fonda spoke, and Dave Livingston, and David Dellinger. Drifting around the crowd, you saw people eating oranges, sharing water, sipping warm soda, talking to each other, and listening with half an ear to the speeches, but not really seeming to care very much. The army of the young did not really need the speeches. They had heard them all before. And yet, they had their great moments. After the rally, as they flowed into that concrete canyon, you realized just how many of them were there. They were chanting, "Fuck you, Agnew," and "Peace now," and "Nixon must go." The voices were brazen and defiant and direct. At 4:15, a U-Haul truck moved into H Street in front of the Woodward drugstore, and cops started unloading helmets and gas masks, and a group of the young started cheering the cops and asked them to pass the gas masks on. They knew that some of them were going to need them. In the middle of the street, young girls were giving directions. Straight ahead for nonviolence, left turn for civil disobedience. Down at Pennsylvania Avenue and 16th Street, there was a brief tear gassing of about 300 young people who were milling about in front of the buses. Beyond was the White House. The park police came out from the buses wearing their masks, and it looked as if a major attack was about to start. But the Mauve marshals intervened with the only weapon they had, their bodies. They formed a line between the young and the police, arms locked, tears running down their faces from the gas, holding on, choking, trying to hold back the rushing tides of blood and anger. For that moment, they held. Marshals went around the crowd collecting stray bottles, and after a while, even the cops removed their masks. Later, moving into the darkness, there was massive gassing and sporadic violence among a tiny minority. But those kids standing in the gas with their arms locked and their lungs seared were the best of America. They are the cadres of the army of the young, and for the first time, they seem to be winning. At Cantien, they were cut off for days, and George Ryan remembers the skies raining rockets and mortars, and men huddling in slit trenches and behind sandbags, and his friends dying, and all of the rest of them wondering whether the month of September in the year 1967 would ever end. He remembers the first convoy to Khe Sanh after the siege had lifted, when they had their quad 50s trained on the sides of the hills and expected death at every turn. He remembers the 2 bloody weeks of the Battle of Wei, when he killed people he did not know, training the 50s out flat and battering the town to pieces. He remembers the time on Highway 1, 3 miles out of Dong Ha, when the mine hit and the truck he was on billowed into the air, and all of them were wounded. At those times, nobody asked him about his hair. At those places, George Ryan did what his country had asked him to do. He killed people and was shot at and saw friends die. And when it was over, they gave him 2 bronze stars and 2 purple hearts and sent him home. He doesn't brag about what he did. He did it, and that was that. And now when you run into him over in Brooklyn, he is getting on with the things of his life. But he must wonder sometimes what kind of country it is that he risked his life for, and for which so many of his friends were slaughtered. Last week, George Ryan finished a battery of aptitude tests for a job as phone installer with the New York Telephone Company. He passed all the tests and then went to see a supervisor at the company's offices at 101 Willoughby Street in Brooklyn. That's when he got the news that there were veterans and there were veterans. They told me the tests were fine, Ryan said the other day. But then they told me that before I could go upstairs for my medical examination and photograph, that I had to get my hair cut. Ryan refused, and the phone company's representative said, well, whenever he decided to get his hair cut, he could have a job. But until then, the application would be filed. Company regulations, she told Ryan, said that a man could have some hair over his ears, but none over his collar. I wear my hair the way I want to wear my hair, Ryan said. I don't understand this. If my hair is short, does the phone work better after I install it? Of course it doesn't. The phone won't work any better or any worse than those quad 50s that George Ryan used so often while the shrapnel was rammed into his young body. What is happening, of course, is that George Ryan is being discriminated against, as are so many other people in his generation, and the cause is the lunatic cause of hair. To listen to Governor Kirk and some of the nastier members of the silent majority, America would be a perfect society if these kids would only cut their hair. There are no other problems, no war in Indochina, no starvation in the Mississippi Delta, no poisoned air, no unemployment, no collapsing economy, no Brownsville, no death of feeling, only hair, some matter that grows on the body of the naked ape. But if George Ryan has not earned the right to wear his hair his way, nobody in this country has. He was at Cantien and Wei and Khe Sanh. Mendel Rivers wasn't. Spiro Agnew wasn't. and neither was a single member of the board of directors of the New York Telephone Company. If he wants to wear his hair a certain way, or wear purple underwear, or stand on his head on a Saturday night, that's his business. None of that has anything to do with his ability to install a telephone. But then, none of this is any real surprise. The young men who have been forced to fight this filthy war have been treated more shabbily than the veterans of any other war. And George Ryan is no different from the rest. There it was on television. That makes it true, doesn't it? I mean, if they say it on television, it has to be right. My God, I kept saying, it's on television, but it can't be right. Nobody would shoot on a campus. They're wooden soldiers with 10 guns. Those aren't bullets. Kids in the National Guard are just kids who aren't in Vietnam. They're not different. They're not shooter-uppers. But then kids on campuses aren't burner-downers either. Yet there was burning down. And if burning down happened, I guess shooting up can happen too. Maybe if I close my eyes, I will think I heard wrong. I closed my eyes. 4 children still are dead. 4 mothers now must learn that to teach a child to say please and thank you is no longer enough. Children now must learn bullets kill, and when the National Guard shoots, you have to duck. 4 fathers are not fathers anymore. When will the sound of bullets reach the ears of men who cannot hear? 4 children still are dead. In this, a world of mourning, I weep for the children who died and for the children who killed them.